Welcome to the Future of Supply Chain, presented by Dynamo. Each episode, we sit down with leaders in the industry as we build the future of supply chain together. Let's get into the show. Here's our host, Santosh Sankar.
Hey, ladies and gents, welcome back to the Future Supply Chain Podcast. I'm your host, Santosh Sankar, and joining me today, a big welcome to Carla DeSantis. Carla is currently the Operations Transformation Partner at PwC. Welcome to our humble show, Carla.
Santosh, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
So PwC is a household name by and large for our listeners who, comprise corporate executives, investors, even entrepreneurs. And so that kind of leads me to perhaps focus a bit more on what is the Carla DeSantis story? How did you get into the wild, wonderful world of supply chain?
Very fun. I actually started in industry, so I'm also not a consultant by origination anyway. I spent a lot of my time in the consumer and retail space, working a lot of retail up through the ranks. So a lot of my work before entering into supply chain was more on the go-to-market side and looking at, especially when you think about vertically integrated value chains and apparel, you see that a lot. An appreciation for, even though it's go-to-market and even though it may start with the product or the portfolio of the customers you're going to market with, appreciating how do you serve them effectively, which takes you back up through the value chain. So very early on, it was kind of hard to extract what is traditionally known as supply chain from that part of the business. And I very much loved understanding, if I'm talking CPG, when we do things like packaging, it is important to understand where do those chemicals come from? Where does that, corrugate actually originate, and sort of going back up again through the value chain. It made me, I like to think, a more effective consultant and also business person. So voila, here I am now doing a little bit of both in operations as well as my continued day job, which is, helping businesses fix their problems. So look forward to it.
Awesome. And, so earlier this year, you published along with your team the Digital Trends in Operations Survey. And I'd love to dig into that for a bit, if you would. Yeah. And I guess kind of first and foremost, whenever I look at survey data, I'm trying to understand who is it that actually got surveyed. So I'd love to just kind of talk about who are the respondents and what's kind of the breadth of the folks in organizations that ultimately were tapped for their insights and sentiment.
Sure. So we use an outside provider. So all the responses are blind, but we vet roughly about 600 executives across mostly the C-suite. We try and keep it to a functional level, if that makes sense, Santosh, because, sometimes the big chiefs don't always know. So we want to get into some of the layers of management a bit. It is across your traditional scopes of what we'll call operations or supply chain. So we follow a SCORE structure: plan, source, make, deliver. SCORE being the sort of supply chain operating model that many reference. And we also think about operations a little bit more broadly, because sometimes the technical vocabulary around supply chain doesn't necessarily include some operators, right? Whether that's field, or as you get into some of these functions like engineering, they may not consider themselves supply chain. They consider themselves engineering. So we also play with the definition of supply chain and operations, wanting to make sure that we're as inclusive as we can to really drive the kind of insights that we want to in operations, if you will.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
And I guess kind of the $1 million question, if you would, what are kind of the key takeaways from the study that you would love to share with our listeners here? What is top of mind for you? What should be top of mind for them?
For them, yeah. So I'm sure you'll have more questions for me as we go. So maybe I'll keep it to the top 3-5 that come to mind. First and foremost, we saw a trend last year where executives weren't getting the return they thought they would in investments, particularly in technology. We saw the same trend this year. Thankfully, the number went down. It's only 69% are still reporting that. I believe last year we had 82 or 83%. But that's still a really important trend. Whether you're in the 80s or in the high 60s, it's still a significant portion of execs who feel like they're not getting the return. Now, that can be for a number of reasons. They've already received the returns, being one end of the spectrum. They're just starting their tech implementation journey or activation journey, being another, and a variety in between. What we found, though, there's a lot of reasons why there isn't return on that investment, which maybe gets into another key learning, the fact that it is varied, that there is a variety of responses between what is the expectation and what is now proving to be the reality, that is not generating the type of return execs expected it to see. There is no silver bullet answer, which begs to a more complicated kind of environment. Most notably around, probably the second point is the lack of clarity around tech investments, really understanding what are the outcomes you're really trying to strive for and what you're ultimately doing to get there. I know that sounds real simple. You would think, well, companies, of course, have an idea of what they're expecting coming out of a tech implementation, particularly in supply chain. We're a bunch of operators. We run that way, right? We're very clear about how to project manage something. But really staying focused on those outcomes and having agility along the way so that you know where and how to flex or reprioritize to ensure that those outcomes still are valid, still are achievable, and ultimately are successful for the business. I think that's where companies are finding they're way more challenging than they thought it would be. I think another insight maybe, and that I'm sure we'll get to it at some point, I always get the question around AI. What's happening in AI? What's happening in supply chain with AI? We found only about 20%, I'll say this statement, only about 20% have reported widespread use across operations and supply chain.
Interesting.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think there's a lot of testing. I think there's a lot of dipping our toe in the water and seeing where and how it can be effective. So the only 20% is widespread. I don't judge it just yet, Santosh. I don't know if that means it's a good or a bad thing. But it does demonstrate that there's still a lot of upside, because I do firmly believe AI is going to help businesses sort of bridge the gap either between broad investment choices or micro investment choices that can continue to move their business forward. So look forward to that too.
Sure. So I have a couple of specific questions here on the study.
Yeah, go for it.
And perhaps we kind of double click on that statement around AI. The one thing that I found really interesting is that organizations don't appear to necessarily be improving the digital skills of their workforce, even as you do see kind of AI starting to crop up in importance, applicability, demonstrating value, which we're all learning is a much different way of engaging with software than perhaps other paradigms. And what are the implications of this? Because, we might be okay today, but is this underinvestment perhaps creating issues that we'll see in future years and maybe as early as next year, perhaps?
Yeah. So simple answer to your question is yes, there will be implications. And I think companies are struggling wherein how to strike the appropriate balance of what it is they're doing to upskill. Very easy to put a sweeping statement out there, I need it. But what in the best path forward to achieve it is probably what a lot of companies are struggling with. We've seen a shortage of resources available, whether you define those resources as folks that intersect into that world, sort of digital acumen as well as operating depth. You see a lack of familiarity with some of the tools and technologies and methodologies that we're seeing coming into play. AI is as much as, I would think you would say this too, is as much a methodology as it is a solution. So, understanding how to play and factor in some of the skills, if you will, that are needed for that kind of success in that role, I think is a bit tricky to find. You have a lot of demanding other sources of demand on that skill set that makes it very difficult for operations to find that nice mix. Now, all of that being said, technology obviously can help you bridge the gap. If I don't have enough humans to do it, tech hopefully can help to sort of fill in and solve for some of those solutions that humans historically have solved for. I say that with a massive caveat that does not mean technology is replacing humans. In some cases, yes, it literally means that. But when you talk about AI or upskilling or digitization, I think there's a massively bad rap and story around technology is somehow in conflict with human development, and I do not agree with that. So going back to your question about implications, I think there's a significant implication if companies don't get that messaging right and don't find a way to help those that are genuinely interested in it accelerate and sort of, engage accordingly. And those that fear it come to realize it's not something to fear as a replacement or substitution, but truly is an augmentation to them and their skill set. And I think that comes down to something around change management. It's not just about the training part. It's about how do we talk about ways of working? How do we change behaviors and get at some of these core principles around upskilling, right? That are part and parcel to the story, just as much as teaching you technically how to do something is. So, but huge implications if we don't get that right. I think something we as operators pride ourselves on, right? We're used to solving hard problems. You see that more in supply chain than you probably do in any other functional area because, we are typically engineers or have a technical proficiency in our background. So as we get into problem solving, it's really hard to want to feel out like, well, what really am I trying to solve for? And who's the best human to do that? And infuse some of that storytelling in there,
So another thing that I picked up on is about a third of technology investments appear to have been hamstrung with integration complexities. Some of that might be change management related, right? Integration into existing processes, working styles. But I'd love for you to kind of expand on that because as a technology investor, right, like my ears perk up when I hear such statements such as integration or complexity, because it could equally be opportunity, but it could also be the source of friction that can stifle otherwise great growth within a software business.
So well said. So integrations, one of the biggest sources of challenges or complexity, let's get right down to it, throw the massive elephant on the table, data, right? How and where, if I haven't had good data hygiene all along, it's very hard for me to now all of a sudden infuse a bunch of different, we'll just assume it's a varied set of technologies and capabilities that go along with those technologies. And we see that a lot in how we approach technology in operations, and nothing worse than putting good investments into bad data and have that suffer. So let's throw that on the table. I do think there is some great solutions out there that help work with, I won't say get around, work with the different structures and quality and history of data, increasingly so than we've ever had before, that is making the excuse of bad data or like different sets of data. It's mitigating against that reason, which is a great sign. I think you also have many companies are struggling with varied instances across the board. A lot of our clients are global. And when you do go into certain markets and have different emphasis on what they need in their, tech stack and what they need to operate with, you see various usage levels, which leads to various instances, which leads to various maintenance structures, which all lead to integration challenges, right? I would also throw on their legacies, right? So if you are, as many of our global companies are, at least some degree of patchwork of different structures that they've had in the past, or different companies, dare I say, or parts of the companies that they've acquired, that continues to exacerbate the complexity that are faced when you actually do go through some of these integrations. A lot of, well, that's how we used to do it, and that's why we do it this way now. Not a whole lot more than that behind it. So when you get to that, how do you help a company get over those integrations? So a lot of reasons for it, no shortage of that. What I would say about it, though, is, again, I mentioned data. It's also trying to figure out what can you do. I love the agile methodology for that reason. It's not trying to answer all the questions. It's trying to answer the first, second, and third questions and build a backlog of things so they really do have an opportunity to put something out there, test it, prove it, continue to improve upon it, and add more to it as you go. So, as many companies I see struggle with integrations, we've also helped them through that using
Sure.
methodologies like agile.
Sure. I'm going to, take this in a slightly different direction related to the report. I noticed that climate, whether it's climate investments, climate as a priority, has become a lower priority for respondents, and curious as to why.
Okay, so you're going to get a little Carla's answer to this. If you're talking to my boss, he'll say like, I don't know what this means anymore. Is it really a red herring? Or is there something there?
Sure.
And we've just put a different label to it and have chosen to speak about it in different ways. My answer to this is there isn't a time in the history of supply chain where we haven't talked about things like that are sustainability related. Period, full stop, right? Whether you're talking about source of supply, whether you're talking about inside the four walls of a manufacturing site and things like water usage and waste and things of that nature,
Sure.
whether you're talking about transportation, fuel consumption, pollution, things of that nature. There hasn't been a time when an operator hasn't had to worry about these things, whether proactively, reactively, or somewhere in between. So when I hear things like climate not being a priority, I'm not so sure it's so much that as it is the way in which we talk about it as supply chain professionals looks and feels a bit different than, say, how an ESG or a sustainability professional talks about it.
Sure.
So, and that's where, again, this is my answer to this question. That's where I think we have a lot more work to do in creating a more common language between us so that we don't think, well, climate isn't a priority. Of course it's a priority, right? It's impacting sources of supply, even if you're in real, hard good commodity driven things, such as, resin or aluminum or, paper. It's impacting all of that. And you can't solve for all of it just through things like hedging. Or sort of traditional sourcing leverage that's allowed you to hedge a bit, right? So I struggle with saying that it's a lower priority. I just think we need better ways of infusing it into the natural course of supply chain discussion, including that associated with technology, so that we're not talking at each other or missing each other when we're talking, and it's part of the solution. Companies I see doing this really well have integrated those data sources into their traditional data sources as they do things around planning, for example. So I see that being probably the tip of the iceberg. How do we infuse some of that data into our planning structures so we see a cascade through? But I don't know how we get around climate if you're talking about supply chain, right? You really can't.
They're very much interlinked.
There's no way you can't, right? We see it now all over the world. And it's not just in certain parts of the world or certain climate events, if you will, or climate trends. We've always talked about El Nino, for example. Well, now we have so much more disruption happening that isn't following some of these known trend lines that it's too big for us to ignore, for sure.
Sure. So I asked you three very specific questions. I'm stepping back here and kind of thinking about, we have about a quarter and a half left in the balance of the year. And I'm trying to figure out, what is the state of the supply chain technology buyer, right? Where's their head at? What are they focusing on or prioritizing? What is their sentiment around the budget that they're dealing with for the balance of the year? Equally, a lot of organizations are about to step into 25 planning if they haven't already started doing some of that
Yeah.
already. What are these kind of budget holders equally thinking about the year to come when it comes down to supply chain tech spending?
So the good news is what we're seeing is a trend of more investment, which is great. I think we went through a period, a year or two back where it was constraining a bit. We're seeing at least budgets increasing, or an intention of increasing budgets. What around varies significantly depending on the industry that you're talking to, and the type of technology maturity that industry, that company has. But there is probably two primary buckets, not surprisingly. So net new investment, we're trying on different things. AI is a great example of that, as well as retooling our existing platforms. So you still see a lot of migration into cloud. You still see a lot of migration into core, what I'll call core technology platforms, planning, manufacturing, logistics, kind of platforms. But rethinking that, I like the term retooling. So they're rethinking what exactly it is that they need and how they need it. It may be integration, it may be instances, harmonization. It can vary significantly, again, across industries and the type of company we're talking about here. But certainly good news, budget, right? And an increase in budget, which is fantastic. I do think this presents a tremendous opportunities for companies to sort of step back and reevaluate capabilities and do that in conjunction with their tech investments. So it really is a hand in glove kind of investment, as opposed to, hey, I think I could do, and therefore I will need kind of thing, right? And I think that, I know some of your audience are obviously tech providers. I think that presents an awesome opportunity for them to come and figure out how do they create bridges, as opposed to sort of stand alone or in competition with existing platforms. As I mentioned earlier, I work a lot in the consumer and retail space, and that's a micro business, right? There's a lot of dissemination of technology across, especially if you work with a global CPG, for example. So for them to reinvest in a massive platform, it's hard for them. So that's why they need both. They need something that's going to bridge them and help them continue to augment their capabilities, as well as, sort of re-platform, retool that what they actually need from a core backbone perspective. Did that answer your question, Santosh? Yeah.
It did. I'm going to kind of poke in a few different areas. The first being around cyber, right? And internally here at Dynamo over the last couple of years, we've kind of, I guess, kind of had this kind of wax wane on where there might be opportunities very specific to supply chain, where there are massive opportunities to strengthen the cybersecurity, right? A lot of industrial systems are antiquated. They may not necessarily be as secure as they once were originally meant or supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so I'd be curious kind of where investment's currently going, and equally, where do you see or hear kind of, hey, there are gaps. We can't find something that's satisfactory to secure our warehouse operation or our transportation operations, what have you.
Yeah. It's probably better for my cyber guys. So hopefully I do them justice on this. I think I'm gonna sort of bifurcate along the lines of industry first, right? So if you're talking about, again, more consumer-oriented industries, you've got a lot of information flowing in access points flowing through operations these days. I show them inventory values. I give them location of where certain goods are. And I'm giving that to me, Carla, consumer, at times. So the interfacing for that is one part of it that needs to be secure, or at least I have to have some degree of control over that. And then, of course, the accuracy of the information that's flowing back and forth and the implications of a decision I make as a consumer based on that information could expose me inadvertently to a variety of things. So
Yep.
making sure that we're being intentional about what we're providing in terms of information and to whom is always at the core of any sort of security question, if you will. And I'm constantly challenging my clients to think about that. Well, what does a supplier get? And what do you get from a supplier? And then go nodes in the value chain up or downstream from that. And protecting that interface and making sure that there are controls around that interface will continue to be, front of mind for a lot of companies. I think what changes that is the speed with which the information is shared. It's one thing if I've set up a secure portal, you log in and you get access to it, but how long is that login valid for? Does it time out after a certain period of time? How accessible is that login to other people in the value chain? Forget about nefarious actors that come in and steal my login. I'm just talking about, hey, I work for PwC. I shared my login with Joe sitting next to me because I was out for 3 days. Where are my controls on that? And I think the fluidity of technology these days is begging us as corporations to ask more critical questions around that. And by that, I mean, you and I as regular humans, I mean, you see what's going on with Netflix and locking down on login controls. We are used to that, right? Everyone's used to like, oh, I log in. Yeah, I get it. But like, it's all fast and loose, isn't it? For something like Netflix, it's not. There are some significant challenges to a company when they're driving information through that value stream, who gets access to that and how they get access to it. So I think corporations are going to have to rethink a lot of those questions, re-examine how they've made choices in the past around access, and then, of course, make sure that there are controls that support that and allow them to still be safe. I think we continue to see the expansion of data protection laws. We saw that come up, obviously, in Europe. It's expanding around the world. I think that's the do no harm stuff, right? I can't be on anybody's list. And those are pretty clear cut. Where does it go after that? You asked me a question around operational technology too, the infusion of different technology bases. So, AI is a great example of that, or some of this OT that's really agile, right? Portable. I go in and I can put sensors on a manufacturing machine and help it understand flows and all that. That's all data access points, right? And information flows. Then I take those sensors off, I put it in a suitcase, I travel that suitcase to the next plant, I throw it on. There's exposure in all of that, right? So how do I think through all of that? It seems very innocent and obvious. Well, I'm in my ecosystem, right? Company A, right? Why do I have to worry? Well, all of that is susceptible to interference, we'll just say. So where and how we're thinking through all of that is really important. I would say companies think about it in its obvious way. External connection points. I mentioned suppliers. I mentioned you and I as customers. But I think we need to think as seriously about internal actors as well, right? And controls around all of that. Although I must say,
I'm going to take that.
Go for
it. Because what you've also described is, this is certainly from kind of the corporate teams that we speak to as they think about AI. A lot of them are stopping and saying, well, kind of this data comes from this group. It's handled in this way. We're not putting it in an interface where every other group in the organization could potentially have access to it inadvertently. How do we think about permissioning our data and our data infrastructure appropriately in order to solve a problem? And I think those that seem to be a bit further ahead than the rest kind of have more of a spirit of experimentation and learning.
Yeah.
But I'd be curious what you've seen, right? As an enterprise leader, how should an enterprise leader think about experimentation, evaluation, and even kind of purchasing such a solution? Are there best practices or even a simple framework you could offer?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very complex question. I maybe how we can get at it is talking about a particular platform. Digital twinning popped into my head, right? Because you were talking about how do I do this safely? How do I allow for discovery, innovation, but do that in a safe and sort of managed environment? I think about things like digital twins, right? That is exactly what it's trying to do. It's trying to help us think through our existing organization and our sort of day-to-day business in different ways in a safer environment that can help us optimize for the actual environment in a very crude way. That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
I think creating environments. So with the digital twinning, let's break this down. What a digital twinning environment allows you to do is ingest that information, and it has that information, whatever it may be, data, process flows, humans, right? Roles, responsibilities, what I have control to and what I don't have control to. I do that in a finite environment, right? That's very secured, right? I can control the access that's coming in and out of that environment. And it allows me also to be really clear about what I'm trying to test in that environment. What am I doing with that data? What am I holding as a control versus what I'm choosing as a variable? What types of things I'm trying to measure? That playbook, if you will, is exactly what you should be doing in your day-to-day world, right? Defining what's the environment, defining who has access to that environment, deciding what I'm going to actually try and test. What are the hypotheses or the scenarios or the simulations that I really want to evaluate, if you will, and define the success criteria on which I'm judging the outputs in advance. Don't do that as you go. That becomes super tricky, right?
Yep.
And then really understand, again, what are my controls versus what are my variables, and what are the parameters by which I'm holding both to be true. I think that's really no different than when you're in your real environment trying to test out what and who should have access and when, right? Don't forget the question of when too. Even in a simple SharePoint site, right? Part of my role is to manage some of the content, right, amongst our team and keep a catalog of that content. Well, you would think everyone should have access to that catalog. Yeah, maybe, right? Because I can edit off that. If I give everyone access, they can edit off of it. They can tweak. Now they got control, access to all the documents that are in that catalog too, right? So thinking through all of that in a safer environment and stealing principles from an incubator, if you will, is really what I'm doing. Is important there. And again, don't underestimate, because in the effort to solve a problem, we focus on the mechanics of solving that problem and don't always think about some of these very related but secondary considerations like access or permissions or decision authorities or visibility controls or things of that nature, right? That usually in the spirit of solving a problem, we're just like gunning, right? And we assume we're all in, and it's a big assumption.
Yep. Well, with that, Carla, we have covered a lot of ground from talking about
sure have. I hope I did okay on
digital trends report. No, it's
Totally.
been great. To kind of more kind of current, what is the state of the buyer? How to think about things like AI and running experiments, which by and large, a lot of supply chain professionals have done. They just need to kind of remember some of the examples that you provided as to, hey, if you've kind of set up a digital twin, how do you create a hypothesis? How do you kind of test or establish success criteria before you test a hypothesis? These are some of the things that they could kind of walk away with tangibly. But I want to kind of finish out
Can I throw one
in what
more
I
thing
call
in
rapid
there?
fire.
because you mentioned
Yeah,
the
do it.
buyer, and then we were talking about some of these other situations. I think if I'm going to leave with one more takeaway for everyone is I think we've historically sat in our, I think there's been a tendency to stay functionally focused, right? I'm a manufacturing guy and you're my IT department, or I'm a planner and I plan for the logistics, right? I think increasingly so, we have to bring those stakeholders to the table sooner, earlier upstream, if you will. And I think we have to work better together rather than, hey, one takes it for a little while and then invites someone in, asks for feedback. I think going back to the tech buying, the more they're informed about what you need, what you're trying to accomplish, what outcomes you're driving for. I prefer the outcomes, not the needs, because needs can be it's sort of a misleader, right? What outcomes are you? They can better investigate, do discovery and diligence, bring to you the types of solutions that are more equipped. I think we tend to talk at each other rather than go together with some of this stuff. So the sooner you can do that with each other, reasonably so, right? And the more you can do it, the better you will be together, right? The better the return on some of these investments and these solutions that you're going after. So I leave that there too.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to bring us home here with some rapid fire. So I'm going to make 3 statements. I want your immediate 15-second response to these topics. You ready?
Go for it.
First up, the impact of the U.S. elections on technology buying activity.
Yes. Interesting enough, in our survey, we viewed more the U.S. There have been elections all around the world. We viewed the U.S. more seriously. Operators here are more worried or view it more as a risk than external elections. I find that interesting. I don't know if that means investment will change here and be different externally, internationally, or what, but there is some curiosity. I think it's going to be tricky in terms of what you can write off. And I think that's what it's going to come down to. Capital and budgetary and tax wise, what is that going to mean? But I'm guessing like everyone else. We have a huge survey
your
coming
favorite
up.
podcast.
I'd love to say it's yours, but if I'm answering it truthfully, I listen to Smartless. I like my podcast to be fun and light, so that's probably my favorite podcast. It's
okay. We'll take second favorite on it.
Good enough.
Last thing on my list, your most memorable summer activity from this year.
I celebrated my sister's 50th birthday down in Martha's Vineyard. So awesome. That was probably with a bunch of family. So probably my favorite memory from this summer.
Awesome.
Again,
well, with that,
second
Carla,
to this podcast.
That's right. With that, we appreciate kind of the time wisdom you've shared with us.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Look forward to reading more of your reports.
Awesome.
Much appreciated.
Right. Have a great rest of the summer. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Follow us at dynamo.vc for all the latest episodes. We'll see you next time.